All right, well, welcome everyone. On behalf of my colleagues at Penn Library Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, which is also known as SIMS, I'm delighted to welcome everyone here. My name is Lynn Ransom. I'm the curator of programs at SIMS, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Nicholas Herman, who's the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator of Manuscripts, and Dot Porter, the Curator of Digital Humanities at SIMS. Many of you may know that the SIMS online lecture series started during the pandemic as a means to bring scholars and students around the world to our virtual table to share and discuss current research and projects in the field of global manuscript studies at a time when gathering in person was impossible. We're now completing our 5th year, and I'm pleased to say that this fully online program still serves its original purpose of bringing together geographically and methodologically diverse audiences in this virtual space to learn more about and to discuss new and cutting-edge research in manuscript studies. Today marks the last lecture in the spring 2025 series, and we'll be taking a pause over the summer, but we'll start back in September. To follow news about this series, as well as other SIMS programs and events, please sign up for our newsletter. And I think Dot will be putting, if she hasn't already, links to our web pages and the link to the newsletter. I'd also like to take this opportunity now to announce that we will be holding the 18th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age this year on November 20th to 22nd. The topic this year is Interpreting the Ancients, and it coincides with an exhibition entitled Reinventing Aristotle that will be held this fall at Penn's Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. The symposium is co-organized with one of the curators, Eva del Soldato, who's professor of Italian Studies at Penn, and we're excited to have her working with us. The topic presents an opportunity to consider the manuscript evidence and the transmission of ancient wisdom and authorities through the medieval and into the early modern period. And our intent is to cast a wide net across disciplines and geographies to approach the evidence from multiple and varied angles. The program will be a hybrid event, as it has been for the last couple of years. And so we hope to see many of you there in person or online. I'd also like to remind you about Coffee with a Codex, which is our weekly online manuscript show and tell led by Dot Porter, and to let you know that we're always seeking submissions for our diamond level open access journal, Manuscript Studies, and encourage you to submit your research either as a full article to be peer reviewed or something called what we call an annotation, which is a section that features shorter pieces on preliminary findings, new discoveries, project reports, et cetera. And it's a section where you can get out research or publish research that you want to get out quickly. Now, having said all that, I'd like to turn to the reason that we are all here, and that is today's lecture. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Babinski. Dr. Babinski completed his PhD at Princeton University in 2020. And he is a historian of philology and religious thought whose research reconstructs the material world and scholarly practices of early modern Orientalists, and also traces the movement of manuscripts and literature between the Islamic Near East and Western Europe. Since 2020, he has held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Copenhagen in the ERC-funded project, the European Quran, which considers the ways in which the Islamic holy book is embedded in the intellectual, religious, and cultural history of medieval and early modern Europe. He's currently writing a monograph on the practice of reading the Quran in early modern Europe. And in the fall, I've just heard, he's told me that he will begin a new position at the University of Georgia in the Department of Religion, I believe. Today, Dr. Babinski will be speaking on the topic of collecting Islamic manuscripts, looking specifically at, as his title says, the Royal Danish Library, a case study in the history of European Islamic manuscript collections. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Babinski. And I now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, for the introduction and for the invitation. And thank you all for coming. So I'm just going to try to share my presentation. How does that look?
Great.
That's good. All right. Then I'll begin. So I'd like to talk today about the history of a often rather understudied but quite important collection of Islamic.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul. It's just the we see the presenter view.
Okay, it's the presenter view again. All right, hold a second. Does it work now?
Not yet.
No,
Still the
sorry,
presenter
I had
view.
Oh, that's so odd.
things covering up your slideshow. I didn't see the presenter view.
Okay, hold a second. I think I have to start all of this over again. All right. There's kind of an art to doing this, I think. So is it still showing?
There we go. That's
now
perfect.
it's good. So I'll talk today about a rather understudied collection of Islamic manuscripts in Europe, the collection of the Royal Library in Copenhagen. And what I'd like to do is just to begin sort of with a very brief overview of early modern Islamic manuscript collecting, and then to try to contextualize the Royal Library's collection through a kind of chronological assessment of the sources of these manuscripts, and talk about where they came from, the kinds of scholars who studied them, and the functions that they served. So and to kind of come back then to some conclusions, contextualizing the Copenhagen collections within broader trends. In this work, I have have had a great deal of help from a number of printed sources and earlier studies. Notably, it's the collection, with the exception of the Turkish manuscripts, has a great catalog by Ermeli Perho. There's a very detailed description of the history of the collection by Stig Rasmussen. And then I think for everything that kind of falls between the cracks of those two, we still have the 19th century Latin catalog. In addition to this, I should say from the onset that this work was done really in close collaboration with my colleagues at the University of Copenhagen, and particularly with Jan Loop and Kentaro Inagaki. And with the help of the Royal Library, and notably Eva Maria Janssen, who I'm very happy to see is here today. So, what was Islamic manuscript collecting in the early modern period? We often talk about this subject in extremely broad terms, as a kind of movement of knowledge or manuscripts from east to west. And I think that when we look at manuscript provenance in the aggregate, we actually see three distinct zones of knowledge transfer. And I just kind of want to briefly go through those. Because I think that this is quite important, that there really isn't one way that Islamic manuscripts came to Europe, but they're different Islamic intellectual contexts that were connected through trade, through the collection, the active collecting of scholars, with distinct European or Western European intellectual contexts and places where these manuscripts were collected. The first of these, and in the late 16th and turn of the 17th century, perhaps the most important, was that of the Iberia and the Western Mediterranean, where you had a number of Maghrebi manuscripts of North African and Andalusian Arabic manuscripts that were collected and studied often alongside a corpus of Latin texts that sort of were collected and moved sometimes through Italy up to Northern Europe. And one of the main things that Orientalists did at this time is that they compared earlier medieval Latin translations with Arabic texts, or the Arabic originals, in order to extract lexicographical information. And this was foundational, for instance, in the first dictionary, which I'll talk about briefly later, by printed Arabic dictionary by Franciscus Rafflingius. The second of these are what you could call trans-imperial networks, and they're particularly related with trade with the Levant. And here, Istanbul plays a central role. The capital of the Ottoman Empire, there were once stable diplomatic relations happened between Western European powers, or sort of took shape between Western European powers and the Ottoman Empire. There were groups of diplomats and scholars who lived in Istanbul who were interfacing and engaging with diplomatic interpreters or dragomans, and they were sort of staging grounds for scholars. These embassies were staging grounds for scholars who traveled to collect manuscripts. And here the intellectual profile is quite different. It's very Ottoman. It's focused on the three languages of Ottoman learning. It involved very often the intermediary forms of work or collaboration with Eastern Christian and Muslim scholars. And there's often a distinctly literary interest. And then finally, there was an enormous number of manuscripts, Islamic manuscripts that came into European collections, beginning in the 16th century, but really through two waves at the beginning of the 17th century and then at the end of the 17th century through looting. So what we can often refer to as Türkenbeute manuscripts. And these are manuscripts, I think the largest majority of them coming from mosque libraries, but sometimes from personal collections that were looted in battle. So sometimes from sort of mobile libraries that went with armies, such as outside of the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, but often from major Ottoman European cities after they were conquered. And here there's a very different intellectual profile. It's really the kind of thing that you would find in an Ottoman mosque library. And there's also a very distinct pattern of dispersal among a number of owners of the soldiers who looted, and the slow sort of consolidation of these collections, first into scholarly libraries and then into institutional libraries. That just kind of as just to kind of give an overview. I think this is sort of a good way of seeing, really in the broadest terms, what Islamic manuscript collecting looked like in the 16th and 17th century. So how does Copenhagen fit into these? It's not the real centers for collecting are in Leiden, Oxford, and Paris and Rome. And Copenhagen, I think, is downstream from these centers of Oriental studies. And so, for instance, one of the most important developments for Danish Oriental studies was the establishment of travel stipends so that Danish students could travel and study in places like Leiden, where they sort of gained access to these manuscripts and studied with some of the sort of principal figures of 17th century Oriental studies. But in other instances, the Danish Kingdom of Denmark was more directly involved in collecting, and this is particularly with overseas trade and at least several instances of scholarly collecting. And I'll talk about two of those, Theodor Petræus and the Danish Arabia expedition. And then perhaps most significantly, and I think this is, if anything, what distinguishes the Copenhagen Royal Library as just an extraordinary source for intellectual historians, it's through the acquisition of scholarly libraries and papers. And so the Danish Royal Library, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century, was involved in the purchase of a number of really major scholarly libraries, which are extremely well preserved today and offer a kind of time capsule of European learning in the early modern period. So the Royal Library is founded in 1648, but it's really through a series of acquisitions of major Danish scholarly libraries in the 1660s that it sort of really kind of comes into existence as a major collection. And one of these is a figure named Peter Scavenius, and he's particularly notable because like a number of these other scholars who were traveling with stipends that allow them to go to places like Leiden, he works closely with a very important Leiden Arabist named Jacob Golius. And Golius is, I think it's not an overstatement to say, something of the founding figure of sort of modern European Oriental studies. He's a student of Thomas Erpenius, and really he sort of goes beyond what Erpenius had done really as an Arabist to study Arabic alongside Turkish and Persian in a really, really sort of deep way. He worked through and compiled numerous dictionaries, and he really just sort of extracted as much information as he could from the Islamic philological sources that were available to him in Leiden. So Scavenius he travels Franeker, Leiden, Oxford, goes to a number of different places, later made a professor of law in Copenhagen. And his library in 1665 is sold to the king. And though in that library we find a relatively large number of Orientalist books, here's just a selection of them. Just to note one, this sort of Raphaelengius Hebrew Bible in 4 volumes is done in accordion binding. So it's kind of a quite interesting example of 17th century binding. And in addition, we find the evidence of his direct contact with Golius. And this one's a quite remarkable example because it shows him, Golius, not only talking to him directly about Oriental studies, but indeed citing the Quran in a quite a poetic way. So he says, it's on Scavenius has left Leiden, and he says there can be no, interval of time and space between us, such as the love of virtue and the friendship contained in this bond. For among life's transitory things, one might consider this eternal, and what is said of God, that everything shall perish, this is a Quranic citation, that everything shall perish but his face, is also true here, as a love is from him and in him. And so this is a kind of mix of Islamic and Christian scholarly piety, and I think it's a strong indication that Scavenius had studied Arabic, or at least Arabic, and indeed perhaps also the Quran with Golius. And in fact, we find a quite remarkable document from Scavenius's collection. This is a copy of Franciscus Raphaelengius's Lexicon Arabicum, and this is the first published, sort of major published Arabic Latin dictionary, really a foundational work in European Oriental studies. We see here his ownership inscription, but we also find within the text itself a variety of annotations, and these appear to be in 2 hands. The first of them might be Scavenius's. I don't know. I haven't been able to properly identify it, but they're of a Orientalist scholar who's studying the text, the dictionary, alongside other available Arabic texts of the time. The more interesting ones are those found here. These are the corrector's annotations, because indeed this copy seems to have been the proof copy that was used in the production of the edition. And it actually tells us something quite remarkable. And I don't think that has been noticed or noted about this edition. And you can kind of see it here. I sort of give a detail. And what it shows, I think, is that an enormous number of corrections, about half of them were listed as errata at the end, but a great many of them were corrected in copy. And so we see that here. And if you just sort of compare, you can see this aleph, this line, the sort of long straight line, has been added by the annotator, indicated in the note. And then down below, you can sort of see the remnant of the letter that was there before. That appears to have been moved or something like that. And I think I found other examples of this, but it's if anybody has sort of insights about this practice, I would be very grateful, because it's still something of a mystery to me, and how exactly that would be done and where we find other examples. There's a number of manuscripts that are also were collected around this time, so in the or produced around this time in the 1650s and 60s by another student, so a student from Flensburg, who goes to Leiden, studies with Golius, and then after 1655 travels Europe and the Levant and collects an enormous number of manuscripts. And this is Theodor Petraeus. And Petraeus's, the majority of Petraeus's manuscripts are today in Berlin, and there are some that are in Hamburg. They were sold with his type by his widow. But there are several that came into the Danish collection as gifts, and two Qurans in particular. Here's one. It's a quite ornate Quran in which Petreius added an inscription, sort of a gift inscription, a presentation inscription in Latin and Arabic, and as well a miniature Quran in which he added an inscription as well. And this is, I think this, if I remember correctly, this was in the Kunstkammer. So this would have been presented, sort of shown there as a kind of curiosity. In addition to this, we have, and it's not entirely clear under what circumstances, we have Petreius's notebooks. And they're very curious notebooks. They show him producing sort of drafts of major texts. And they show him often really fixated, as we can kind of see in this image here, on producing, sometimes often before he's even finished or even progressed very far in his work, producing elaborate title pages, and even sometimes sort of quasi-satirical dedications. And indeed, in one instance, we see, the dedication has been sort of redone as one king dies and another king comes to power. We also find what was almost certainly a kind of a gift to the king as a presentation, sort of angling for a major project. And this is a sort of a copy of the first surah of the Quran with Turkish and Persian interlinear translation facing a Latin translation. And this is notable both as evidence of Petreius's ambition as a scholar. He was sort of always angling for big projects that would get him, so to speak, grant money, but also of his scholarly collaborations with an Eastern Christian scholar, a scribe in Leiden, originally from Aleppo, named Shahin Kandi. And I think it's fairly certain, it's really just on the basis of the handwriting that you can make this connection. But there are other manuscripts that Shahin Kandi copied for Petreius. And I think it's fairly certain. So they were working together in Leiden in order to produce something that would be a kind of showpiece for a possible project. So we find remnants of these projects within the notes left by Petreius as well. We also find a quite remarkable manuscript that Jan Loop has talked about in some detail, and I would recommend everybody to look at Jan Loop's essay on Ludolf's Quranic studies, because it goes into this in some detail, as well as my essay with Jan on looting and learning, on the use of looted Qurans in European Oriental studies. Early Quran fragments were collected in the 1620s from Cairo by a traveler there identified as Frederick Buxvold. And this is notable because there really aren't very many places where early Quranic fragments were kept. And they're almost entirely in large and important mosque deposits. And what starts happening around the 1620s and 30s, and Jan's highlighted another important example from the same time, and something that kind of happens here and then in the 18th century, but really just explodes in the 19th century, is you have travelers who are bribing the overseers of these deposits in order to basically take leaves or to take these old fragments. And this is quite significant for, these fragments are quite significant for scholarship. So the fragments that are in Copenhagen are later in the 18th century, late 18th century, used for some of the earliest scholarly study of Kufic fragments, or sort of Kufic script. Another major source of the early collection of the Copenhagen Royal Library was the library at Gottorp Castle in Schleswig. And this is a kind of an extraordinary collection that sort of took form, at least the Orientalia, in the mid-17th century, but it didn't come to Denmark until the first decades of the 18th century, though it's within the Kingdom of Denmark. And Orientalia, or the Islamic manuscripts there, are very closely connected with the figure of Adam Oliarius, who was also a librarian in the library, and who accompanied a embassy from Gottdorf to Esfahan in the Safavid Empire. And he describes this, he sort of has this pioneering travel account where he describes in detail the journey and everything that he sort of saw along the way. But he also had a real interest in languages and took an interest in literature as well. And he's most famous for his German translation of the Golistan of Saadi. Sort of tells this whole story about how he's in Shamahi and he, meets these Muslims, so makes these Muslim friends, and he studies Persian with them, and they say, you must translate this text. This is canonical, great work of Persian literature. But he also has brought back a number of interesting manuscripts. I think this is the most remarkable of them, which is a very important medieval, sort of large medieval cross. There's just several leaves of sort of a set of 30 volumes of the Quran that was in a mausoleum in Safavid Iran, and that indeed manuscripts from this sort of this same set were later looted in probably maybe Buda, maybe Vienna, around 1683, and are now in the libraries in Leipzig and Dresden. So it's a kind of remarkable example. So he collected it there. He sort of bribed the overseer just to kind of take a couple leaves. But it's a remarkable example of just how complicated the roots of these manuscripts can be, because presumably those volumes that are in Dresden and Leipzig were looted by Ottomans at some point, or came through some kind of market from the mausoleum to Istanbul. So the manuscripts that are in Copenhagen, however, from Gottdorf are particularly noteworthy because they cast light on a somewhat mysterious figure connected with Oliarius, which is a Safavid secretary who defects from the Safavid embassy that's then sent to Gottorf, to Schleswig, named Hakkverdi, and he defects with his son as well. And we find a number of manuscripts connected to Hakkverdi, and who seems to have been, so he's quite learned, he seems to be been a kind of a quite interesting figure, and for at least 5 or so years after he defects, after he sort of stays in Germany, he works as a kind of helper to Orientalists, first to Oliarius, then he goes to Leiden and works with Golius, and then he comes back. And here we find the copy of the Golistan that he made for Oliarius. It's just notable that Oliarius meant to put in notes in the translation, and it's mostly blank. And he also produced a number of manuscripts for the library, and at least in this instance, this one's given a quite elaborate binding, which is notable, and it's in a kind of quasi-Islamic style. Though it's an interesting example of how the end flap has been sort of poorly constructed. So it's very, if you were to sort of pick it up, it's very awkward to use this manuscript. In addition, we find later manuscripts where in the colophon he gives his Christian name after his baptism, so Friedrich Christian. And indeed, I've just been sort of scouring. I won't go into details. I've been trying to find all of the manuscripts connected to Hakkverdi. This is sort of such a fascinating figure. And at the end of his life, he's baptized, he converts to Christianity, and then dies. And I think in order to sort of secure a place for his son at the court, which he seems to have done successfully. And I've been trying to find traces of his son, but without any real success. However, I was able to find a quite remarkable document of Hakkverdi's life in a Copenhagen copy of the Historia Saracenicus. This is Al-Makin's Universal History in Arabic that was edited by Arpenius and then finished by Arpenius' student Golius, and published. And there's a version of it, just it's an edition just with the Arabic, and there are annotations by Hakkverdi in them. And we find sort of long sort of Persian passages that cast light on his everyday life and his sort of intellectual, I don't know, concerns and health problems. And as well, we find at the front, and I presume this isn't in his hand, but of someone else's, he had it done, a kind of a poem that sort of with his name at the end of it, that I think gives something as of the character of his personality. So God's word with blessings, a good horse and a sword, gunpowder with bullets can help you in a pinch, and it's rhymed, but it gives a sense of the type of person he was. He seems to be quite an interesting individual. We also find um, from around this time a number of kind of manuscripts here and there that came in with scholarly collections, and that seem to have to show the kind of general interest, often sometimes quite superficial, of Danish scholars in Oriental learning. Orientalist learning, and this is a kind of good example of our Hangname. So it's an Ottoman manuscript that was collected by a Danish scholar who is studying in Leipzig. I think the timing suggests that this is almost certainly a looted manuscript. This is kind of one of the like hundreds of Ottoman manuscripts that just sort of circulated within German lands around that time. I think there's little evidence that he could really read it, but he put an inscription, so he puts an Arabic inscription with this name, and then he takes an Arabic proverb from one of Golias's publications to add in as well. We also find sort of other interesting things just kind of downstream from the Orientalist learning of the time. And this is another sort of mystery for me, which is it's a copy of the Pseudo-Lucaris translation of the Quran, and it's a still quite mysterious Latin translation of the Quran that seems to have been done in the early 17th century. It's often referred to or attributed to Lucaris, but that's almost certainly wrong. And I think the scholarly consensus now is that it probably reflects the papers left in an Orientalist Nachlass of somebody, of a maybe German scholar, of a Western Central European scholar, who is translating the Quran word for word. And so it's actually for Orientalists who are interested in reading Quranic Arabic extremely useful, because it offers a kind of something much closer to a Latin gloss on the original Arabic. But it circulates in the 17th century, and here we have a 17th century copy of the manuscript in Latin with quite a nice binding, an ornate binding, and as well something that I don't quite understand, which is a number of inscriptions from a family or people all sharing the same last name that are dated on the back the fly leaves and end papers of the manuscript. So if anybody has any ideas what this might be, I'd be very grateful to hear ideas. If you've seen something similar, I'd be grateful, as I find it's kind of quite odd and mysterious, and doubly so because this translation is so odd and mysterious. And then in addition, we find a number of manuscripts that don't have a clear provenance at all, but appear to have come at least before 1800, and that probably, my guess is, were related to the kind of Türkenbeute, these looted Ottoman manuscripts that just kind of circulated. And some of them are quite stunning. This is a fantastic example, a collection of Turkish poetry that's presented on Ottoman silhouetted paper. And this is a kind of a decorative paper that's used by basically pressing paper onto cutouts of leather, and sort of infuses the sort of silhouette onto the surface of the page. Around the turn of the 18th century, there are several scholars in particular who contributed manuscripts to the library and papers that show the growing connections between Danish scholars with a kind of European Orientalist republic of letters, of a kind of scholars in places like Italy and Paris who shared some, in Germany who shared a similar interest. This is a manuscript that Jan and I found recently in Copenhagen among a number of sort of uncatalogued manuscripts. That's a translation of a large portion of the Quran um, in the hand of Matthias Ankersen, who was a Danish Orientalist. He's later the Bishop of Ribe, so it's a quite significant position. And he's interesting because he's part of a kind of a Europe of a network of scholars who are particularly in England and the Netherlands, who are sort of looking at Islamic texts in a new way. And they're interested, of course, in the Quran, but they're also interested in a much sort of broader selection of Islamic sources to have a kind of understanding of Islamic practice beyond this kind of monolithic view of the Quran as Islamic scripture. And so they're notable in particular. I'll just actually just to say quickly about this Quran translation. Ankersen studied with a German Orientalist who was in Cambridge named Henry Sieck or Heinrich Sieke. And Sieke's Quran translation is now lost, though we know that he translated the entire Quran. And Ankersen's translation might reflect that translation. Um, and it includes a number of notes that were all taken from a very common and accessible Quran commentary. We also find, but it's not unlikely that Ankersen could have done this work himself, since we also find work to prepare an edition of a sort of short hadith commentary, and so the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that are transmitted through these sometimes quite elaborate or authenticated these elaborate chains of transmission. This is the kind of thing that really didn't interest Orientalists in the early 17th century, but the scholars in places like Utrecht, Cambridge, Oxford are turning to in the first decades of the 18th century and for good reason, as historical sources. They contain just a trove of useful information about early Islamic practices, but also as sort of guides to Islamic religion and religious practices. And but at the very least, this shows a sort of a deep engagement with Arabic texts. And we also find, most likely through Ankersen, a number of manuscripts that were that come from earlier generations of Orientalists in Leiden that were acquired through the collection of Adrian Reiland, who's a professor in Utrecht. And that are of quite significance, and again are among some of the manuscripts that Jan and I sort of were able to identify among these uncatalogued volumes. This is, I think, one of the showstoppers. This is a Quranic glossary that was compiled by Thomas Erpenius, and then annotated by Erpenius' student Golius and Golius' student Hottinger. So we see here, I mean, it's just a remarkable document of scholarly continuity in Western European Quranic studies. We have sort of three generations of Orientalists who are reading the Quranic Arabic text through this glossary and a manuscript, Erpenius's Quran, which is now in Oxford. And also, we find bound into a interleaved copy from Golius's library with Golius's annotations of an Arabic poem that he edited. And so he sort of working on his own translation, and that translation was published by Ankersen with his notes. We find a page of, I think, hitherto unidentified printing of an Arabic poem, the poem on the soul attributed to Ibn Sina. So it's printed in 1633. So it's not clear why this was printed, but I suspect it might have been used in instruction, that this is the kind of thing. We also have the original source manuscript with Golius's annotations. So we know he had a particular interest in this. And Golius was particularly sort of interested in or focused on literature as a kind of test of one's philological chops. It sort of contains difficult historical language, and understanding it is a kind of is just a task of being a good philologist. We also find manuscripts associated with another Danish Orientalist from the time, Frederick Rostgaard, who's a kind of wealthy traveler who spends a lot of time in Paris, and then he's in Italy, and works together with a Damascene, sort of itinerant Damascene Arabic teacher named Solomon Negri, about whom we have a number of great essays by Jean-Paul Gabriel, Paula Manstetten, and so he's quite well documented. And here among Copenhagen's collections, we find notebooks connected with Rostgaard's Arabic studies, and as well as the manuscripts related to Rostgaard's production of a collection of Arabic proverbs. And you can sort of see how all the proverbs have been cut out and then pasted into this book. And here we have a kind of a sort of a Arabic grammar chart that was produced, I think, by Negri, and calligraphic exercises, presumably by Negri for Rostgaard to practice. And in addition, I'll just be very brief about this, but if anybody's interested in the subject, I gave a talk at the IAS about this a while back, and it's on YouTube. For some reason, we do not know why, an enormous, most of the papers of an important late 17th century librarian and Orientalist, Louis Pieck, came into the Royal Library collection, are now part of the Boelingske Brevsamling, the sort of core letter collection in the library, and they're just an extraordinary view of late 17th century Oriental studies, because Pieck was a kind of a hub of scholarly communication. He talked with a lot of German Orientalists. He was a kind of mentor figure for some of them on their travels. And in addition to that, we find a number of manuscripts which are scattered now among the sort of Islamic signatures, or signatures of Islamic manuscripts that are in Pieck's hands, and probably came from his papers. So later in the 17th century, the most important and really, something that it represented an attempt to kind of, really get a kind of good stock of important Islamic manuscripts in Copenhagen. The most important acquisition was related to just an extraordinary scientific expedition that was put on kind of like, with a lot of information and input from a broad scholarly community, to send basically specialists out to the Near East in order to collect manuscripts, to map, to collect botanical specimens, to observe ruins and inscriptions, called the Danish Arabia expedition. And this is well documented, and it's a tragic story. There's sort of 6 scholars of different specializations, and only one comes back alive. But Carsten Niebuhr, who then produces this really remarkable travel account that just is a kind of treasure trove of information that was collected along the way. The figure who was most important for the collection of manuscripts on that trip, there's about, I think, 118 manuscripts were collected, is Friedrich von Hauen, who studied Arabic in Göttingen, and then it really seems to have been in the kind of like he's trained as an Arabic philologist specifically in order to collect manuscripts and record inscriptions on this trip. And we have, in addition to all of the manuscripts that he collected, we have quite remarkable notebooks, really deserving of close study, both from his time at Göttingen, showing how he studied with kind of leading figures of the time, like Michaelis, and perhaps more significantly of his notes sort of recorded during the expedition itself. And there's sort of 2 volumes of sometimes things sort of pasted in that are now in the Royal Library. There also are we find in the Royal Library, a number of connections with India as a kind of a source of knowledge about Islamic texts and of manuscripts themselves. Now, this manuscript is a very interesting one. It's not in the Royal Library, but it's notable. It's in Oxford now by way of Leiden, and it was owned by Jacob Golius. But it probably contains Danish annotations, and those are probably of Willem Lyle of the Danish East India Company. He was a governor of Tranquebar, and somebody who was a contact for Leiden Orientalists and brought back a lot of interesting material. This is just to kind of point out that this is kind of these connections are quite early. Lyle seems to have maybe helped a German Orientalist in Leiden learn Persian, brought Persian manuscripts back to Leiden, and he really was a key figure, particularly in the study of Persian. And the work hasn't quite been done yet to find all of the manuscripts connected with him, but he seems to have been a figure of some significance. I haven't found any Lyle manuscripts in the Royal Library, but there are important documents related to his travels and work in the Royal Archives. Later, however, we find a number of manuscripts from the 18th century that were copied in Tranquebar, so from the Danish colonies in India. So this is one example, and it's stated specifically that it comes from the Persian interpreter for the Danish East India Company. And we find a very interesting collection of manuscripts by a physician, a doctor, Peter Johann Flor, who traveled around India and collected manuscripts. And they're notable for these ownership inscriptions and the details he gives about how he acquired them. So there's quite a lot of details here about the kind of what do you say, like the networks of travelers and collectors in India at the time. And just to point out a work that's not a manuscript, but is, I think, it's notable for the kind of 18th century reception of Islamic texts. We have one of the first Mutafarrika editions of the history of the West Indies. So one of the first books printed in the Ottoman Empire in Ottoman Turkish. And it has a contemporary 18th, a very, important by 18th century binding by one of the most important Danish bookbinders of the time, bookbinder for the court. And it gives a sense it's a beautiful object, but it also gives a sense of the value and interest in such books. The Royal Library really transformed in at the turn of the 19th century, and particularly through the head of that library, Daniel Moldenauer. And Moldenauer, I think he's really kind of made the library as we sort of see it today through enormous acquisitions. Notably the collections of Otto Todt and Peter Friedrich Summ. But he's also kind of an interesting figure in his own right, and had sort of Orientalist inclinations. And we find, for instance, recordings or notes from his travels. He was in Spain, England, France, the Netherlands, Italy, and tracings that he did in manuscripts on his travels. And Moldenauer's acquisitions, and the acquisitions around this time, included a number of major Orientalist collections. So one is the manuscripts connected with the Call. The Calls is a family of Orientalists in Copenhagen, including a number of notebooks, as well as what I think is perhaps one of the most interesting manuscripts in Copenhagen's collection, which is it's sort of quite a kind of astonishing document of the sort of interreligious collaboration. It's a work this is a Turkish commentary on the Golistan of Sa'di by the editor of the first complete Latin translation of the work, Gergentius. But what's remarkable about it is he copied it in Istanbul with the help of an Ottoman scholar, and that scholar's hand appears in the manuscript at places. So this is kind of like we see with manuscripts like this how Orientalist learning was rooted in places like Istanbul. And this comes from the Call collection, so from the Library of Abraham Call that then goes into the Royal Library. The most important of these, however, is an acquisition by Summ that came into the collection with Summ's library. And those are the manuscripts of Johann Jakob Reiske. And Reiske is really important as which might sound a bit odd, he's important as a copyist. So he owned Islamic manuscripts, but he really copied important manuscripts that were in Leiden from the collection, Leiden's collection, from in particular the collection of Levinus Warner. And he copied entire manuscripts by hand, and that was, he sort of copied a sort of something of a library for himself, and we sort of see a number of different examples. And these are really notable because if you copy the manuscript for itself, then you can do all sorts of interesting philological things with it. So you can produce indices, you can reference particular pages that you then have access to because it's in your library, and you can collect lexicographical information from these sources, especially from literary commentaries, in your own dictionary, which is what Reiske does. And so we have, for instance, Reiske's copy of Golius's Arabic lexicon with an enormous amount of information that was culled from basically medieval Arabic commentaries. So we see somebody who's kind of taking the next step in Arabic lexicography through this practice of copying. And in fact, these sets of practices are quite notable. They seem to spread with Reiske to multiple generations of Orientalists in Germany and in the Netherlands. So we see these kind of Reiske-esque copies sort of popping up basically everywhere. And if you go into a lot of Northern European collections, you'll find things where people are basically trying to copy manuscripts like Reiske copies them. The Reiske manuscripts are significant, particularly he left an enormous amount of important Greek material, but he also left an unpublished edition of Abulfida's Universal History in sort of two big volumes, as we see we see in this page slide. And they're published from these sources after his death. And I think, something that would be really worth looking into. They give preserve the practices that he used in order to compile and produce this sort of mammoth work. So we find, for instance, all of the work that it was involved in producing the philological apparatus for the edition, including, a large number of notes, like here, some are collected in books, and here are collected on a string. So presumably he's kind of working through the notes and then putting them on as he works through them. And then sort of kind of wrapping up, we also find going into the 19th century a number of new acquisitions. And this is just a kind of interesting example, again, often from Danish Orientalists who travel abroad. Here we have Povel Lemming. It's a Danish student and Orientalist who studies with Sylvester de Sacy, who's kind of the great Arabist of the time, and he's given the manuscript copy of Hariri's Maqamat that the work that de Sacy famously edited, that has the annotations of an earlier 18th century Orientalist who was reading the text through a Turkish source. So it's kind of on its own right, it's an interesting manuscript, but it's a great document of a kind of learned travel and gifting in the 19th century. And Lemming's manuscripts, we find a number of them, including copies that he made that are now in the Royal Library. And just to kind of briefly mention some of the other major later acquisitions, the correspondence of Heinrich Lebrecht Fleischer, the great Leipzig Arabist, is in the Royal Library. The manuscript collection, largely Persian, of the Persianist Arthur Christensen. Several quite interesting Islamic manuscripts in the library of David Simonsen. And Ottoman manuscripts that were bought from Oscar Rescher. And I know that there's work going on related to Rescher, who's a kind of interesting, he's a German figure who was a kind of broker of manuscripts in the early 20th century. So with that, I just want to kind of conclude with a few general observations. So first, what I find particularly interesting about Copenhagen is what it tells us about what you might call the secondary centers of Oriental studies. We have an enormous amount of focus on these kind of towering figures and collections, places like Leiden, Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale, and Oxford, and these sort of big 17th century collections where the best scholars were, and that kind of seeded a lot of the ideas and texts that would define Oriental studies into the 19th century. But what we see in Copenhagen is that there's a kind of similar and sometimes derivative, sometimes sort of downstream work that's happening in these secondary centers. And I think it's quite interesting. It's just an open question about how we think about that. And the second, we see sort of layers of accumulation. I think that this is particularly interesting. They kind of come from a number of different places, that a collection is not something that is sort of, at least in most instances, done kind of in one go. But you have a number of different scholars who sort of deposit manuscripts over centuries, often with different things in mind. And it's particularly notable in how we see the kind of changing character of Orientalist scholarship from a very biblical focus, though not exclusively, to this sort of modern disciplinary subfields that we see take shape in the 19th century. And then finally, I think the Copenhagen collection in particular is a remarkable document of Orientalist networks. And I mentioned before that these scholarly Nachlässe were like these sort of scholarly libraries, where they're sort of time capsules of scholarly study, of what an Arabic, an Arabist or an Orientalist philologist would have done in the 18th century or 17th century. And I think that's a characteristic of what we find really kind of across the board with these manuscripts, is that because they're sort of bought from scholarly libraries, they're kept together, and that they're often just very, very well documented on things like note-taking. And they also show, I think in particular, and I cited a few examples with Hakkverdi and Solomon Negri, they're remarkable documents of Orientalist collaboration. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that really detailed look into the sort of the way that the manuscripts come from these different aspects of the knowledge transfer. I haven't really thought about breaking it down in the ways that you did, and I thought that was extremely helpful to understanding the motivations behind collecting. I think Nick is going to be leading the questions, and
yeah, I'll if anyone has questions for our speaker, please put them in the chat. I might start Paul with asking a couple of sort of general questions. The first one is, has there been any attempt, or have you thought about sort of using kind of network analysis or kind of digital tools to map some of these interesting kind of circuits and kind of intellectual the associations between some of these early Orientalist figures, or is there a larger project kind of doing that? Because it strikes me as a kind of interesting sort of pan-European. I mean, the pan-European connections are, the infra-European connections are as interesting as the kind of Orientalizing ones. And then also, I mean, whether any of this rich history, sort of locally, how aware people are of it today, and whether there's sort of plans to perhaps exhibit some of this material, or do sort of further kind of sort of almost public outreach projects, because I imagine that a lot of this sort of intellectual heritage is just not particularly well known in Copenhagen.
So yeah, thank you for the question. So on the first one, there hasn't been anything doing network analysis or digital mapping of these connections. I think it really wasn't. I don't know if it was widely known, especially talking about this peak correspondence, because I think in particular that that was even in Copenhagen. And it's not. I think I mentioned this. It's not clear how it came. Might have been Moldenauer. It might be a lot of secularized material floating around after the French Revolution. But there really is a there's just this, I think it's 100-something letters to and from Peak, and that really show him as the contact person for German scholars in France. And there's, I think, and I've been trying to kind of piece it together from some of the other letters that you find in places like, well, there's in Berlin, obviously in Paris, Italy. There's clearly a network of scholars that are between like Milan, Paris, Copenhagen to a certain extent, but really like Ludolf in Frankfurt, Grodek, I think, is in Gdansk or Danzig at that point. There's a pretty stable network that people are that moving along. So you get a recommendation from a friend, and then you can kind of bring that letter to Peak at the Bibliothèque Mazarin, and he'll help you do research. And I think like it would be very interesting to bring all of those sources together, however you do it. I think I'm a little I'm always sort of skeptical about network analysis, besides like how cool it looks to sort of see everything on the map. But even just like it's this enormous number when you're dealing with these sort of correspondences like that are all over the place. Just bringing everything together would be, I think, an enormous accomplishment. On exhibiting some of the material is a very good question, because we have a number of people in attendance today. We're trying to do just that, and so Felice, Chakir Philip, and Jan Loop are developing a project to really look specifically at the Turkish manuscripts in Copenhagen, and to think of ways of doing outreach and exhibiting those manuscripts. I think the big question is how interested the Royal Library is in doing things like this. So we'll see. But there's still a lot of work to be done on the collection, and I think there are a lot of opportunities. Especially since the Copenhagen also has a second really extraordinary collection of Islamic manuscripts in the David collection, to show these things off.
Great. Well, we'll watch that space. Thank you for your answers. Do we have other questions from the audience? We have a question from our colleague Shreve Simpson, who writes a fascinating history. Thank you so much. For art historians, it helps put into perspective the intellectual and historiographic background of Johannes Petersen, whose The Arabic Book, published in Danish in 1946, while today somewhat outdated, was a fundamental publication for those of us who started out in Islamic manuscript studies during the 20th century. It's a fascinating comment.
Yeah, thanks for that.
And other thoughts from the audience or questions? We have a long comment from Natalie Rothman. I'll read it out. She asks, Paul, I'm wondering if you'd like to reflect on the tension between understanding the genealogy of European Orientalism through the lens of transimperial mobility and collaboration, and the profoundly extractive and unequal nature of the process of collecting manuscripts in Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal hubs, and then shipping them to Europe to build the various European Oriental libraries. The example of Reiske, among others, illustrates how the philological interventions that produced new knowledge in the late 17th and early 18th centuries relied on this extractivism and ultimately severed the more circular ties that existed previously, leading to a bifurcation of knowledge where the study of Arabic and, to a lesser extent, other Islamic languages in Europe could proceed as a European pursuit with limited input from Arab scholars themselves, enabling what Mohammed Tafakoli Targi dubbed Orientalism's Genesis amnesia. How do we reconcile these perspectives? So a lengthy and kind of meaty question, but I read it out for the benefit of our audience, also for the recording.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you for this question. It's a big one, and so there's a lot that's going on here. I wouldn't agree that it's always unequal. I think that question is a basic one, that scholars of the sort of these Oriental studies that haven't quite worked out, which is how much these manuscripts cost and who could afford them. And so, but I've noticed, for instance, in the 17th century, so it's the major Istanbul collection, the Orientalist collection from the 17th century is the collection of Levinus Varner in Istanbul. And he's really the only person who gets something equivalent to like a very, very good, Ottoman library. And he's only able to do it because he's the Dutch resident in Istanbul. He basically skims off of international trade, and he has a lot of money coming in. He buys manuscripts. He has a big household, but he's quite exceptional. And we find accounts from Orientalists who were traveling in Istanbul in the mid 17th century, who are dismayed that they cannot get more manuscripts. And that they're competing with, so they're kind of in contact with these Ottoman scholars, and then they're competing with these Ottoman scholars for access to and ability to buy these manuscripts. And I don't think they feel like they're winning, or that are in a particularly advantageous position. That changes by the turn of the 18th century. And how that changes under what circumstances is just a kind of interesting open question. Where, and especially by the 19th century, that the ability for these Western and Central European collecting efforts to just acquire enormous numbers of high-value manuscripts is much, much greater. And I think part of that late 17th century, so you have sort of state involvement of, like French, people like Galland who are going around collecting manuscripts. But I think there's probably just broader sort of geopolitical economic shifts that make that possible. But I don't know exactly how that works. And I think it's a kind of interesting open question. I would say, I mean, on the idea of Genesis amnesia, I think that that's right, though I think that that's not typically true among Orientalists. I think that's true or more characterizes the kind of post-Saidian history of Oriental studies. And I think to a certain extent kind of in response to this sort of disciplinary history that put a lot of emphasis on these kind of disciplinary heroes like Reiske as people who had a very distinct mentality that allowed them to be, serious philologists or something like that. But I think that there's like, and I think it's true kind of in a continuous way among Orientalists that they tend to often see these things through, and if they're focused on Islamic intellectual history, from an Islamic intellectual historical perspective that privileges the works that were the sources for these Orientalists. And I think that's really key, even beyond the collaboration, that like there's a certain amount of kind of cross-cultural collaboration that historians are often very interested in because it typifies an attitude in a kind of a collaborative attitude or an openness or cultural openness. But the most sort of significant collaborators for these Orientalists, so to speak, or sources for these Orientalists were the towering figures of sort of Islamic learning whose manuscripts or whose texts they read and based their own work on. So, it's really these Ottoman, Persian, Arabic dictionaries that become the major lexicographical works that are printed in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It's the commentaries. I've worked on the stuff related to Persian. There's these Turkish and Arabic commentaries that are really the basis for editions. And so there are a lot of examples like that. I'm trying to think if there's something. So there's so I think that Genesis amnesia is a good concept, and it's well put. But I think I also would kind of question how much of that is even there. I'd also say, there's an interesting, and I forgive me if I'm rambling here, but I think that there's I would love it if somebody argued the opposite and said that these Orientalists did something that was distinct from their. Everybody kind of wants to find the sort of Islamic roots of this and wants to focus on sort of cross-cultural contact, which I think is enormously important. But there's a basic question of how much of like was new. I mean, how much has to do with like a print culture, how much has to do with, say, like a scholarly culture in places like Leiden, models, people like Scaliger. And I think that the 19th century, sort of people who wrote these 19th, 20th century disciplinary histories that really privilege that sort of academic context didn't have a really complete view. But I think it's still an interesting open question, and it'd be interesting to see if anybody really would argue that. It'd be nice to look at Reiske and say, like, Reiske is working with all of these medieval commentaries, but like, what is it that's distinct about how it is that he's working with them? Because he's doing all these things. He's indexing, he's producing, all of these references, and they're building into this kind of philological machine that I really don't think has an equivalent in the Islamic world of that time. So that's just as a sort of open thing. But I like this. I mean, it's something I've thought a lot about. Um, I don't know if I got everything, but that's sort of my thinking on the subject.
Wonderful. A nice substantive answer to a substantive question. And we have another question from Josh Mugler. I don't know if, Josh, if you want to unmute and ask the question aloud, or if you'd like me to read it.
I can. You're welcome to read it, or I can
Go,
ask.
go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just asking if if there are significant numbers of Middle Eastern Christian manuscripts as well as Islamic, and what the kind of networks were there, and what the interest of the Danish state was that might have been propelling those interests. Because I know a lot of the French and the Russians and everyone were trying to interact a lot with and of course the Catholics in Rome as well, with the Middle Eastern Christians, to kind of assert spheres of influence.
So that's a good question if there's a good Danish equivalent to that. And nothing comes to my mind off the top of my head. There is a lot of interesting Arabic Christian material. And just a few, I mean, some of which comes through France. So there's a number of interesting manuscripts that were done by a scribe that worked for de Sacy. There's one in particular that's really interesting. I think it was collected in Cairo in the 17th century, and it's Arabic, but there's a lot of early Latin annotations, probably by monks in Cairo. I can't remember the exact circumstances of it, so that's quite interesting. There's also, I would say, generally, there's a lot of interesting material, much in the same way that I was talking about with the Islamic material. There's a lot of good sort of looking over the shoulder of scholars as they learn and work kind of stuff. So for instance, with the study of Syriac, we have notebooks and grammars that are copied by hand and things like that. I'm trying to think if there are any other examples. I'd have to think if anything really good comes to mind beyond that, I'll let you know. But that's sort of what comes to my mind immediately.
Thanks a lot.
Great. And do we have any other questions from the audience for Dr. Babinski today?
I have a question if no one else does. And you mentioned that a little bit earlier, I think in a response to a question. You mentioned something about like the value of these manuscripts, and I was wondering like how much data is there available about the trade, about the economics of the development of these kinds of collections, and what kind of impact the development of collections had on the trade, sort of back and forth influence. I don't know. I mean, I work a lot with catalogs, with the Schoenberg database of manuscripts and collecting price data, but I guess I haven't done this kind of work with Islamic manuscripts. And so I'm wondering how much, in your research, I know this hasn't been the focus of your research, but is the data there to sort of think about those kinds of questions?
It's there, but somebody's just got to go through and because it's sitting on an end paper somewhere. It's just like 1,000 little bits of it's a big jigsaw puzzle where every piece is in a different manuscript often. So we also sometimes we find in correspondence we'll get like lists of books with prices.
Mm-hmm.
That's really useful. But I would think, and I'd be really curious if anybody's done this for other sort of areas, is just create a structure in which you can put this information as people encounter it. So I would say there's a lot. I mean, very often written. There's often you get prices written by Islamic readers as well, and it's sometimes just on a flyleaf. Sometimes noted. I'm trying to think, would you be maybe in a catalog, like a manuscript catalog, but probably more in these like price lists that get sent. But there isn't anything And I have to confess profound ignorance often on what these numbers mean. You try to figure it out sometimes, but it changes, and it'll be in different currencies. And it's of like, how pricey actually is this manuscript? But it seems like, to kind of go back to Natalie Rothman's question, which is a really good one, of like, how much of a power imbalance is playing in the acquisition of these manuscripts, big sort of geopolitical economic forces. And it would do a lot. I mean, just an enormous amount, even just to have a database of these prices in order to see how they change over time and how people are able to collect.
I can say there is a structure in place. There's a Schoenberg database of manuscripts that does collect this data, but primarily historically for European manuscript traditions. And it would be great to find a project where someone would be entering this kind of data, but that's sort of the trick, is finding the people to do this work. But if you're interested, I could talk to you more about it offline. But it's, yeah, I'd love to see something. I'd love to see data gathering in this regard, because we just don't have access to the information in an easy way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would go a long way, even just to get a sense of like what the scale of these efforts are.
Yeah, and people are coming across it in their work, but there's no, like you say, they don't know where to put it. Like you can put it in the Schoenberg database, but you have to know about the Schoenberg database to do that. So, thank you.
And we have a few further questions. I think we have Eva Maria Jansen, who has her hand up.
Yeah, and it's just that it feels more and more embarrassing to keep quiet here. But Paul and Jan and Phyllis and everybody else knows so much more about all these manuscripts than I do, having inherited responsibility for the Oriental collection a couple of years ago and not being an Orientalist myself. So that's why I have kept silent about the contents of my own collections, which is very, very embarrassing, but facts of life. But I just wanted to note on this about the prices, because as far as I remember, in the manuscript NKS 133, von Haven's notebooks from when he bought the manuscripts in Cairo, Alexandria, and wherever before passing away, he noted also the prices, because I remember that when we did the exhibition for the 250 years jubilee of the expedition, I tried to sort of translate his prices in Egyptian currency at the time via 5 or 6 other currencies into some kind of equivalent in Danish kroners at the time in the mid 18th century. So it's really also a matter of trying to find out, okay, is this a year's wage for a baker, or is it 3 oxens, or is it the equivalent of something to buy a great palace? So, but that's just a bit curious. But I know that there are, for example, for von Haven's, I think that there are prices for all. I only checked the Hebrew manuscripts at the time, but I think that there are more prices in that document. So that could be something for someone to take a look at. So just a humble addition from the contact person, so to speak. And everybody are so welcome to write to the Royal Library, the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen, if you have any questions. I can't answer them, but I can at least tell you what we can see out of our data. But really, Emily Parrow's catalogs and also the other ones are the source for the Arabic manuscripts and also the Persian manuscripts. And then we'll see what happens with the rest.
Yeah. Thank you for that reference. I was thinking about this price list when I was answering in the and I'd also add that for anybody interested, it's a great place to work, Copenhagen, and they have been extremely helpful with basically anything that we've needed. So very grateful.
Thank you on behalf of the Royal Danish Library.
Great. And do we have any further questions for our speaker? We have a little bit of time if we have questions. If not, I think it's been a wonderful wonderful lecture and some wonderful discussion and an amazing collection that I think was unknown to most of us. So thank you so much, Paul, for this lecture. As Lynn mentioned at the beginning, this is our final lecture of the online lecture of the semester. So do stay tuned for in the fall for our next set of online lectures and our other programs at the Schoenberg Institute. And if you haven't already done so, please visit our website, schoenberginstitute.org, and sign up for our monthly newsletter. So thank you to our speaker, and thank you all for attending. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul, so